I think it's really important as you're going through different stages of selling to bigger and bigger deals and bigger organizations to understand what is the value prop that matches your pricing and why should the customer actually buy this? Like, don't think about your top line, think about the customer and
Customer
why
value.
is it relevant for them to buy this. So we go back to the idea of like all of this should be centered around the buyer experience and the fact that you have reps to pay and they have deals to close. Your customer doesn't care about that. Like they just care about getting value from your product. Too often, I think companies struggle to have an enterprise plan that makes sense.
Welcome to Thrivecast. Our today's topic is revenue intelligence for startups, and with us we have Francis Brero. He's a co-founder and CPO at MadKudu. And to all the listeners who don't know him yet, here's my quick take on introducing him. And Francis, you could correct me if I'm going wrong with my introduction there. Francis did his industrial engineering from École des Ponts in Paris, or closer to that. And he did his mechanical engineering from Stanford. And I find this very unique with an industrial background and a mechanical background. By the way, I'm also a mechanical engineer. No, hello there. He honed in on his math and data science skills. He worked at Agile One in implementing sales engineering, which is where I think that's where he probably decided that sales engineering needs to be disrupted. In 2015, Sam Levan and Francis pitched their idea at TechStars, the demo day pitch. And I do remember watching the YouTube video much later, I think in 2019 or 2020, when somebody sent me that, hey, there's a possibility that you can increase efficiency. So his pitch was something like this. So most companies are struggling to convert less than 5% of trials to paid plans. And he made a pitch to increase efficiency for the conversion rates. What a brilliant way to pitch. And I think this was born MadKudu. Since then, they've been leveraging data science on primarily marketing and product usage data to find gems or whales in the equation. So MadKudu is probably the leading provider of the revenue intelligence. And with that, Francis, welcome to Thrivecast. And could you share a little bit of your background and why did you and Sam get on the journey of starting up MadKudu?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on the show. Excited to be here and to share a bit of the story. I'm glad to hear the initial demo day pitch aged fairly well. So yeah, at the time, I think even PLG was not that well coined of a term. People were talking about like trial conversions or freemium models. PLG wasn't yet a thing. What led us really to start MadKudu was, as any startup, many iterations. But one of the big things we discovered was working with a former CMO of ours from Agile One, who had actually joined a company that had a pretty strong free trial motion. That person was looking to hire a data scientist and was asking us to help interview this data scientist. The aha moment was realizing that a CMO of a tech company in the Bay Area was looking to hire a data scientist, which if anyone's hired a data scientist in the Bay Area, they know it's incredibly expensive. This is like a massive line item to add to your budget on the marketing side. It just seemed like curious that someone would need that kind of a profile on the marketing side. And as we started digging deeper into it, we realized that this motion that was starting to grow on the SaaS side of offering free trials and freemium models was generating a massive amount of first-party data that most companies were not equipped to handle and to make sense of. And so they were starting to hire data scientists. And so we saw an opportunity in the market to leverage this combination that we had of data science skills and an understanding of go-to-market, having built one of the first CDPs in the business. So that's the insight that led us to start MadKudu. And over time, it's evolved to, we call it revenue intelligence, but it's really about how do we bring back intelligence to our go-to-market process so that we can be contextually rich instead of just like rich in personalization.
So maybe just to add a little bit, could you tell us a little bit about what does MadKudu stand for and how do you tie that with revenue intelligence? These two terms together were popping in my head. I thought I'll ask you on the call here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's happened in the past few years is that we've had a pretty strong shift in go-to-market strategies towards maximizing efficiency, right? Everyone has been talking about how do we maximize efficiency. We've seen things like the predictable revenue playbook that became the way to grow teams where you just hire a bunch of fresh out of college BDRs, buy them a list of phone numbers and have them crank the phones. And that has been slowly starting to break. And what we stand for at MadKudu is this idea that making for a good buyer experience should be prioritized over go-to-market efficiencies. And the way you make the buyer experience better is by leveraging all of the first party data that you have at your hand, right? When people are downloading content, when they're interacting with your website, they're leaving these digital breadcrumbs, and you owe it to your customers to be able to leverage that information to make your outreach more contextual, to make the experience more contextual, rather than just sending them a hello first name, I see you work at company, I love companies like yours, and buy my software. So we've created as an industry a pretty poor buyer experience. And at MadKudu, we really stand for making that experience better.
Maybe we can jump into maybe the subsequent question to that. And that's a good segue. So Francis, do you see that as a secular trend? Meaning companies who have been traditionally invested in a sales-led approach with the growth efficiency starting to hit in, have they started to increase their investments in a PLG world? Or are you seeing, basically, are you talking to more PLG-first companies or SLG-first companies as you're building and growing MadKudu? What do you see out there?
I think what's pretty interesting for us is that if you are a PLG company, you very likely have a lot of first party data. That's all the product usage from people that are in a trial or in a freemium. So the pain is that much more obvious. That being said, on the sales led side, what we see is that a very good sales rep is going to be looking through the CRM, through the marketing automation platform, through LinkedIn Sales Navigator to look for information and to try and be very contextual in their outreach. While it's much more obvious on the PLG side, we're also seeing something similar on the sales-led side. I will say that this past year, we have seen fewer sales-led companies trying to break into PLG or introduce a PLG motion. However, on the flip side, we've seen a lot of PLG companies look to start a sales-led motion. And I think that is coming primarily from pressure that's coming from the board to close bigger deals and to accelerate revenue. PLG is a very capital intensive go-to-market motion where it's very similar to brand, where you have to build up a brand, build up a sizable foundation of users before you can start monetizing, which is terrific when money is cheap, like it was in the past 10 years. I think today that motion is being challenged a little bit by interest rates going up. And it means that it's a less appealing go-to-market motion to start. So we're seeing less of that shift these days.
Got it. And are you seeing, maybe let's fast forward to about maybe 5-7 years from now, do you see that the industry would have more pivoted towards PLG first approaches, wherein most of the use cases that were pioneered by sales-led growth companies would now become more aptly available in PLG first companies, and thus disrupting the entire industry? Or do you think there's a balance that will be achieved where PLG and SLG will coexist as a PLG first and an SLG first, but then over time they're going to layer each other? What do you predict?
I think it's a good question, and we're starting to see more people talk about this. Our strong and core belief is that we are moving to a hybrid motion where there will be some PLG and some SLG. And this goes back to the idea that ultimately as companies, we need to work on making the buyer experience better. And not everyone wants to have the same buyer experience, right? As an end user of a product, PLG is probably the best way to experience value from the product. You want to use it. You want to see how it integrates with your workflows. As a potential decision maker, doesn't necessarily log into the product, you might want to be educated as to how is this going to make your team better? How does this fit into the overall ecosystem? How will this grow with your team? And for that, you typically want more of a sales-led motion than a product-led motion. So I think even within a given account, you will have different personas that are going to have different affinities to these go-to-market motions. So I don't think one or the other is going to take over. I actually think they live in symbiosis and they have to feed off of each other to make for a relevant account journey.
Got it. So PLG first approach companies will add sales-led motion as a new layer, and then sales-led companies will add PLG as a notion. But could you maybe check on this question? Is it difficult for an SLG company to add PLG? Have you seen that happening more successful? Or is it the other way around? PLG first companies can naturally transition into SLG, but not the other way around. What do you see as a trend there?
Yeah, I think they're difficult in different ways, but I think going from sales-led to product-led is very difficult. The biggest challenge is that transition generally will take at least 9 months before you start seeing monetization from the product-led version of the go-to-market motions. Actually spoke on our podcast with the CPO of Apollo, which is one of these companies that started as sales-led and then introduced a product-led motion. It took them 9 months before they started seeing revenue come in from the product-led motion. And this is a company that was still a fairly small startup at the time. We're talking 50, 60 people when they did that. Yeah. So if you think of a more established company, it is very complicated and you have to create a separate team to do this. When HubSpot did it with Sidekick, it was also a completely separate team that was cut off of HubSpot that was working on this. And so you need to have that discipline to know you're investing for 9 months on something before it generates revenue. On the flip side, if you are product-led and you're introducing sales-led, there's a bit of a mentality shift that needs to happen as to what makes for a good lead, right? A lead that is likely to swipe the credit card is not necessarily a great lead to send over to sales. So there's more of a mindset shift that needs to happen of having reps that don't just wait for demo requests, but are starting to, go after end users to understand how the organization works. And so talking to end users to then go outbound the decision maker is something that product-led companies tend to struggle with, because the reps that were very good at pure transactional sales on top of product-led struggle when it comes to closing bigger enterprise deals where you have to do outbound. You can leverage information from the product usage within the org, but you're still doing a pretty much outbound motion where you're going to the decision makers, the different functional buyers that you have within the org and trying to understand the lay of the land within the account. And that's a more traditional sales-led motion that a lot of the folks who have done primarily product-led, sales-enhanced go-to-market are not great at.
So what you're saying is the product-led motions are more indexed towards inbound, and you're getting the leads and you're getting the conversion through product-led as an inbound. But if they have to add sales as a new layer, you'll have to again go back to the traditional mechanics of outbound and go back to maybe use product usage as the signal to have conversations with them. But sometimes they may not be even using the product. You still have to go do an outbound. Looks like
I think maybe the one thing I'll add in there is, to me, if you think of, I'll put it up and down to think about the org chart where you have the economic buyer at the very top and the end user at the very bottom. I think the inbound motion is more in the middle, where you typically have an operator who's downloading your ebook or something like that. Yeah. In PLG, you're talking to one layer further. So now going from this layer further, the end user, all the way to the economic buyer, it's that much bigger of a leap than it is in an inbound motion. So even reps that are good in inbound and know how to go from an operator to the buyer, those folks, it's a bigger struggle to go from an IC end user all the way to the buyer.
Got it. I think you put it very nicely. So maybe let's assume that we'll maybe build upon that. It's probably slightly easier to go PLG first and then add sales as a new layer, of course, with sales comp and figuring out who the whales are. We'll talk about that. But let's start with maybe an early stage startup. So here's a scenario. Let's say there are many early stage startups being created every year. I'm guessing it's about 30 to 40,000 every year just in the US itself, which are B2B SaaS companies. What would you advise them? How should they think about a PLG first approach if they decide to go that way? And let's maybe paint a picture of this way, that they may or may not have achieved a PMF yet. Would you advise them to go start the PLG journey, meaning at least the self-serve journey part of it? What should they build? What should they buy in-house, build in-house or buy from external vendors? And how should they put all this together before they start thinking about layering sales in any which way?
Yeah. First off, I would tell them to make sure that going product-led yields some form of a competitive advantage, right? That's one of the biggest challenges, is that we look at Slack, we look at Miro, and these are amazing successes on the PLG side. But like a Miro, one of the reasons why it works in PLG is that PLG is a motion that works really well with the product. There's a lot of products out there that don't necessarily fit well. Even Asana, to some extent, Asana works really well as PLG within an account, but there's no virality. A user of Asana isn't going to recommend 10 new companies. So I would argue that that's not necessarily where you want to have PLG, or if you do, you have to have clear virality loops that are identified that you can latch onto. And then I think when you're thinking about what tools you want to build or you want to buy, my recommendation is always that you buy to accelerate, but not to start, right? So if you want to try a motion, typically try by building something very basic to test the assumption, to validate that there's opportunity there. Once you have seen success and you want to accelerate it, that's when you can make the decision of bringing in tech that you're buying. But there's a lot of software out there that sounds great on paper. Oh, Loom is using this, or Figma is using this, but they use it at a stage that's not yours. And so it's important to know that you're buying something to accelerate accelerate what you're doing already today, rather than just buying something because you think it's going to start a new motion.
So let's maybe build upon that, Francis. I think, let's say they've decided to go PLG route, and they have also decided to go the self-serve, and they want to build the self-serve portion of it. They don't have yet a salesperson in the team. They might have some founders who might be talking to the customers, maybe early stage companies, right? Early stage startups at that stage. Would you recommend them to start building at least some baseline analytics, so that if it's a PLG first company, they need to know who these users are, the usage, or is that too much at that stage for them?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the first thing I will say is that founders are sellers, right? That's even if you're a product person, it is critical to understand that when you're starting and you're a founder, whether you like it or not, you are the first seller of the company. And really, that's one thing that's in my mind like a big mistake that a lot of product founders make, is that they think, oh, we're doing PLG because we think there's something dirty about selling and going and asking for money from customers. But the truth of the matter is that's when you get the best product feedback, is when you're asking someone, will you give me money for this? And they tell you, no, I really like it. I'll use it every day, but I'm not sure I'm willing to give you money. And then it's okay, what would it take for you to give me money? And that's the moment where you get the most relevant feedback. And so that to me ties also to your analytics question, where I think there is a danger, especially with technical founders, that we're so comfortable behind analytics. We're so comfortable behind dashboards that we defer to those instead of going and talking to customers. There's much more to learn from talking to people than there is to learn from sitting behind dashboards and hoping we can live in a minority report world. Yes, I think investing in analytics early on is important. Not over investing is critical. Not to promote companies just for the sake of it, but we used Amplitude as a pretty lenient, like a pretty big free tier. So I think like understanding what are the kind of like companies that offer a free tier where you can at least like pipe all the data in and like it's some basic reporting of what people are doing. I think Amplitude is a really good tool for that. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but doesn't need it. But really critical is to know, what are we trying to measure, why we're trying to measure it, like what is the question we're trying to answer, and not just measuring for the sake of measuring, and then using that measurement to feed customer interviews.
Yeah, so I'm catching on two of the three trends that you talked about. First, figure out, if you're an early stage company, figure out what's your growth loop might potentially look like. Do you need PLG or not? And if there are some good growth loops, good virality that you can add to your product, maybe start from there and then start measuring. But that does not mean that you should not be talking to customers. You should be actually more indexed towards talking to customers. Looks like that's the advice that, and that's a very sane advice. And I've seen your pitch at Demo Day. I'm talking to you after so many years now. The difference between the Demo Day and now is that you have probably talked to hundreds of SaaS builders and SaaS companies. You lost your French accent, at least on this call, I can't feel any French, whereas the Demo Day was a mix of that. And I think to the listeners, Francis could be your lookup guy on how to build a startup and be a good founder there. Francis, maybe let's build upon this particular story. Now that the early stage company has figured out that they want to go PLG, they have invested in self-serve, they've invested in some analytics, could be Amplitude or Mixpanel or whatever they might choose, or they might like. Now they have achieved PMF, they're starting to get a lot more sales coming in on a repeated basis. What would you advise them at that particular stage? I call this stage as the mid-stage company, wherein there's some repeat sales coming in. Now they have to go start hiring more people. They have to figure out who do they hire, should they hire a dedicated growth team or not, different product capabilities that they might have to build. Outside of the app itself, the core capabilities, they might still need to go and do various things, but they want to get ready to have some big whale catching. So what is it that they need to think about building or instrumenting? What do you recommend to these companies who are at this stage?
Yeah, that one is always tricky, right? Because when you're starting to grow beyond that initial success and starting to close bigger customers, that's when, having sellers that, again, I would say the founders should close the first $1 million in revenue. That to me is like a bare bones baseline. As a founder, you should close the first $1 million in revenue of your company. But then beyond that, bringing in a sales team starts making sense. And then you want to understand what DNA you're going for. I think one of the risks there is going for too big too soon. I think a lot of folks are like, they'll see their first sign up from an IBM or a Microsoft or a Salesforce, and they're like, all of a sudden, oh my God, we can go close those those companies. Hold your horses. It takes a lot to go and close those companies. First off, there's not one decision maker. There's a deal desk. There's like committee that makes decisions, and you need to manage that committee. You need to understand how everyone is deciding. There's compliance, which is going to become a pretty big challenge. And you need to be SOC 2 compliant. You probably need to have legal to be able to review all the red lines they're going to do on your contract. So having a salesperson that knows how to navigate that is a slightly different breed. I think that's where when you're hiring salespeople, it's really important that you look to hire a rep that has closed in the same band of revenue. Like a rep who's used to closing at a 12K ACV is very different from a rep that closes 50K or 100K plus. And not being too ambitious as to what you're going to close is really critical. Don't bring in a rep that closes 100K deals when you've never closed anything over 20, because that person is just not going to work. So really finding reps that have been in a similar startup-y stage, like they don't need tons of enablement and things like that. It's another mistake. You hire people from a great later stage company and you think they're going to crush it. Most of those reps are really good because they have training wheels, right? Like they have sales enablement on one side and they have like marketing feet, like PMM giving them a bunch of like collateral, and then they're going to be great at closing deals with all of that. But if you remove that part, all of a sudden it becomes very different for them and it actually is not enjoyable. So really that's a very unique breed of reps that is critical to find. And I do think is one of the defining moments in that stage of a company. So I would say that's probably the most critical. Obviously, growth, especially on the PM side, because it's important to have this kind of full stack growth PM that understands building the product all the way to selling the product, like really full stack. But that generally, if you've made it to that stage, you have a PM that's been there from the start that has that sense of how we're building the product and how we market and sell the product. So that's why I think like sales is probably the critical role to bring at this stage, because you very likely have a growth, like a PM on the growth side. And I'd say PMM is too early at this point. I would recommend against it. Your growth PM should be doing PMM. Data analytics, too early. Have your full stack PM do that. All of that will be a problem at the later stage. But for now, really what you need to do is just keep on improving the product and like getting someone to close deals.
So I'm trying to reduce it in my head. I'm taking some notes here and we'll probably put that as part of the show notes as well. So this is what looks like you're saying. At a mid-stage company, you don't have to necessarily hire from a larger growth company. They might need a lot of other help. So that typically most of these companies have sales enablement teams. And if you don't have them, these guys may not be very successful. So hire someone who can be a figure it outer without all the training wheels that's given to them. Know your customers is probably very important. You don't have to necessarily run sugar high. If an IBM signs up to your product, and they may not necessarily buy it. So you don't have to necessarily go and try to close them. Sure enough, you can try, but you may not succeed unless you have the procurement, the legal desk, all the compliance aspects of it figured out. You mentioned probably go hire a growth PM, a full stack growth PM, who's hands-on in the data analytics part of it, as well as figuring out what metrics to capture and what makes sense for the business. But don't yet hire PMM, don't hire data analysts. That might be a little too early, and still continue to invest on your PLG-first product, right? Making it easier, making it simpler, and adding more value to the customer. It looks like that's the summary. Is that right?
Absolutely. And if you can find a former founder as the growth PM, that's ideal.
Oh, former founder. Could you tell a little bit
because
about
they're very full stack, right? Like a former founder is typically going to be well versed in full stack capabilities and understands that the job is going to change every 6 months.
Are you saying former failed founder? There are lots of them available.
It doesn't really matter. But I would say, failed founders is great. It's almost every company fails, right? It's like the success rate of startups anyway is like 2%. But I think it's valuable because they've been through this. They've seen a lot of things not work, and they understand, again, like the most important thing is to understand the job is going to change. I think, again, like you hire a PM that's like coming out of a great university, I don't know, like a Stanford or whatnot, like a lot of them are not going to be comfortable with the idea that you're a little bit of the janitor of the company. You're going to go clean up some data, and then you're going to go clean up the copy on the website, and then you're going to go be a sales engineer for one of the deals coming in. And that's your job, is to do all of this. That's the role of a PM. And I think too many people think of like the PM role, like this like Google thing where like strategizing on like how we're going to take over the world. That's like the wrong kind of PM. That's actually going to be disastrous for a company.
Yeah, I think the PM, the product manager playbook is getting written as we speak. So there's a whole bunch of things that's happening, merging of PMM and PM. or feature PM and growth PM and PMM all coming together. So we'll have to wait and watch. But I think you're catching on to a particular thread there. In the interest of time, I know we have only a couple of minutes left. Could we switch on to some of the growth stage companies? And at this stage, let's say they have figured out who to hire. They might have probably a few folks in each of these, should we say, departments. There might be a growth department, regardless of the fact whether it is fully dedicated or cross-functional in general, but there are people who are working towards that. They're starting to now see the signals coming in from their product usage data. They're starting to see the likes of IBM signing up. They might see folks on larger companies who are interested in their product. What would be the best set of signals at that particular stage when you have already figured out there's already a set of conversion that's happening on the self-serve part of it? People are coming in, signing up, they go to your pricing plan, they understand your pricing, they click on it. But you might also have an enterprise pricing plan, and you might have a lot of content at this particular stage, marketing content particularly. What would you say are the best signals for cross-sell, upsell, typically what we call it as catching whales?
Yeah, that one is a tough one because it to some extent depends from one company to another. But there's always two aspects that you want to take into account. There's one aspect which is really you can call it the ICP fit, or just how good of a fit is this product for this company or these other products like the enterprise tier or the multi-products. So that's one. So understanding what is the make of a company that is likely to buy your enterprise tier or your multi-tier product. That's number one. That can be done through an analysis, like statistical or not. That doesn't really matter. But then being able to surface that insight to everyone within the org, not just sales, but even from a growth perspective, to know what is the onboarding journey for one of these enterprise companies, and not just looking at the user level, but also looking at the account level. So when we're thinking about the make of this enterprise potential company, who are the people that are typically involved in the decision making? How do they typically interact with our website, our product, our sales team, our partners, and tying all of that together to understand what are the behaviors that make sense to look out for to determine if there is potential. That's the second signal, is really this behavior. Like, how does the behaviors we're observing relate to success we've seen in the past? And acknowledging that not everything is going to happen in the product, not everything is going to happen on the website. It's a mix of everything. So we go back to the hybrid motions we were talking about. But yeah, you're very unlikely to have a CIO sign up for your product and start using it. And if you're selling, let's say, to banks, they're very unlikely to connect their data because they're a highly regulated industry. So what you want to see is like some signals of maybe someone signing up for a webinar or maybe for the product, but not really activating the product ever. They just want to get a feel for what the product looks like. It's like all these different signals, and like connecting them together is what helps understand that there is a strong opportunity. Then even on the cross-sell side, we'll see this a lot where you have a company that's a customer of yours and you're either seeing new divisions that are interacting with your website or with your product or with other products that you have to sell, bringing all of that data and consolidating it at the overall entity level to be able to run what we call IT consolidation plays is a pretty important one to do. It really isn't that hard. And I would really insist that there are ways you always want to crawl, walk, run. There's easy ways to get started. And then as you're trying to get better and better at not missing any opportunity, that's when you start going into more of the finesse of data analysis.
Yeah, I think to the listeners, especially who are the mid-stage companies and growth stage companies, you should probably look up MadKudu if you haven't done that yet. They're probably one of the most secular. They bring in all of these signals together. And I've seen the demos of it. I'm not yet a user of it, but we will consider when we grow slightly bigger. But if you are a growth stage company or a mid-stage company, please do consider MadKudu. They're probably one of the deepest source of collecting various sources of data and bringing together a central intelligence dashboard towards it. I know we are out of time, Francis, but maybe could you share any failed story that you have seen in the past where you worked with a customer who went with the PLG-first approach thinking that, hey, I'm going to go jump head on into the PLG world, but they failed. They failed either to do whale hunting or they got stuck at just the baseline individual or team layers, but they could not upsell at a company level. Anything that you could share?
Yep. Absolutely. On that one, I'll share a story of this was a company that was doing cloud recording in a collaborative way. Think of it as a competitor of Loom. What was really interesting is that they managed to get an incredible amount of organic signups. They were in the 30,000 signups per month, so really healthy. And they were getting a good amount of self-serve conversions, so people were swiping their credit cards and buying solo plans. So at some point, the founders decided, let's hire a sales team and let's try and close close some enterprise deals. Like exactly what we've been talking about, because they were seeing some like MailChimps and like Salesforce kind of signups. They're like, oh my God, like these are great companies. We can go close them. Unfortunately, this initiative completely failed primarily because the enterprise pricing was not differentiated enough from the solo pricing. It was really difficult for the reps that were hired to justify to a potential buyer why it made sense to buy the enterprise plan. Ultimately, the user were saying, look, we're very happy with our plans. And the thing is, the way your pricing scales, it doesn't really make sense for us to go buy an enterprise plan because we're just going to provision more and more seats and we're not seeing super strong value in going to the enterprise. This is a story that I've seen multiple times. I think one of the typical ways people solve for this, which I'm not a big fan of, is security. Trello was notorious for doing this, where what they would do is they would go after all of their banks and highly regulated customers, reach out to the CIO and say, oh, did you know that if you're not on the enterprise plan, you don't have user management? And so if one of the employees leaves, the Trello board is going to be leaving with them. And that's really bad for your data and all that stuff. And you're like selling through fear to the CIO, which again, at a time where money was cheap, people would swipe their credit card and be fine with it. Today, if you try and run that play with a CIO, the CFO is going to come behind and be like, we're shutting the entire thing down. This is really not the right way of going about it. And the long story short, I think it's really important as you're going through different stages of selling to bigger and bigger deals and bigger organizations to understand what is the value prop that matches your pricing and why should the customer actually buy this. Don't think about your top line, think about the customer and why is it relevant for them to buy this. So we go back to the idea of all of this should be centered around the buyer experience and the fact that you have reps to pay and they have deals to close. Your customer doesn't care about that. Like they just care about getting value from your product. And too often, I think companies struggle to have an enterprise plan that makes sense, especially with seat-based products. It's a challenge that everyone has seen, right? Envision had that challenge and as one of the early PLG companies, and it creates this fairly low ceiling to your enterprise tier, which then becomes a problem because we all know that once you want to get to 100 million in ARR, you need to be closing multi-million-dollar deals, which is impossible if you don't have a pricing that scales and scales reasonably in a way that makes sense for the customer.
Yeah, it's a great insight. I'm trying to reduce that from a quick insight standpoint. I think, Francis, what you're saying is figure out your enterprise plan. That should not be solely based on single sign or enterprise security or group or skim interactions. It should be a lot more than that. But I think the market today is still devoted towards the enterprise SSO as their enterprise plans. But I think over time, as PLG becomes a lot more available, it might get better. But again, thank you so much, Francis. It was a pleasure to host you on this particular podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
And to the listeners, if you have any comments or feedback about this session or any other future podcast that we will do, please leave your comments. And thanks again for joining.